Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be looking at how hypopressives can help your clients with pelvic floor dysfunction. The first thing I'm just going to talk about briefly is just there is a piece of research that you might be interested in reading. So this is Navarro-Brazález et al. Their paper actually shows that pelvic floor muscle training and hypopressive training came out equally as good in an RCT. So I'm going to pop that in the description below so you can have a quick look at that. There are other studies, but that's a very recent study which is worth reading. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 7 different points on how hypopressives can help your clients, and then at the end what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a few snapshots of some of the clients I've worked with, what their diagnosis was, how they progressed, and so you can see in kind of real time how they progressed over our 3-month progressive hypopressives program, which is called Create Lift. Hypopressives will really improve your client's pelvic floor proprioception. So this has been shown in the research. Again, I'm going to link it in the description. But if you've got ladies who are struggling to squeeze and release their pelvic floor and you want to get them into doing pelvic floor muscle training, this is a great way in. And actually you can do some very simple poses on the floor just to get them going, and they should start to feel that connection with the pelvic floor and be able to squeeze and release it. And a lot of this is to do with fascia release. It can happen really quickly, and that's another point I'm going to go into in a minute. Second point is that hypopressives is also great for your clients who've got a high tone pelvic floor and they're not getting the symptom improvements that you want. So if they are struggling to see improvements, say they're 4 or 5, and they're actually finding that kind of can't do any more pelvic floor muscle training to improve their symptoms more, doing hypopressives can help to rebalance and actually reduce symptoms. So I've worked with a lot of ladies who have been told that they can't do pelvic floor exercises because it's aggravating their symptoms, and hypopressives coming in has made a massive difference to their symptoms. So the third point is it releases the fascia in the diaphragm, and in turn, with the synergistic movement with the pelvic floor, it releases the fascia in the pelvic floor. We know that that can happen really quickly, and I think that's one of the reasons why the women that we work with start to see improvements and notice them within about 4 weeks of starting hypopressives, some even within days, within a week or 2. So it's really, really fast for them to start noticing some sort of change, and this has got to be to do with fascia release and decongestion in the pelvic floor. So that's a really key area. So if you've got clients who are super, super tight through their diaphragm and you're trying to get them to breathe better, this is a really good way of getting them to do this in a really natural way and just taking these really lovely deep 360 breaths with the vacuum and just encouraging that pelvic floor movement and synergy with the diaphragm. So the fourth thing is that it really helps to improve posture and whole body tone, and we found that adding in more poses increases the benefits. So we teach the foundational poses for about the first 6 to 8 weeks, and we normally see like a nice improvement there, and then once we start to add in the advanced poses we get another improvement in symptoms. And it's really, really interesting to see how actually challenging the breath work in harder poses, which are going to work the glutes and other big muscles in the body, and actually really challenge the breath work through the vacuum because the poses are harder, leads to better outcomes with the technique as well. So the fifth thing is that I have touched on it, it does help to decongest the pelvic area. So any of your clients that you feel like pelvic area is really boggy and they're really uncomfortable, it can be a really great way to just mobilize the pelvic floor and get things moving. And this goes into the next point, which is number 6, which improves constipation. It does seem to stimulate the bowel, and that we think is that's through the breath work and just getting things moving. And obviously there are other things to consider as well in terms of constipation, but hypopressives can be really, really helpful, and I've had ladies who feel that they've completely resolved their constipation just by adding hypopressives in, which is really interesting. So number 7 is it improves the posture. We're looking to get the pelvis in a really good position and obviously the whole body, so we can get that lovely synergy with the pelvic floor and the diaphragm. But we're working on the posterior muscle chain a lot through the poses. So when we're holding our arms in these sort of positions here, we're really working through the lats. Everything's interconnected into the pelvic floor. Those little forward tilts we use as well is working all the way through the posterior muscle chain, strengthening through the hamstrings and the glutes, through the back of the pelvic floor. So that's really, really important that it's used as a progressive technique and that you can build on the poses to get more substantial benefits from the technique. The other thing I'm just going to say here is that there are a lot of misconceptions about the hypopressives breathwork, and there are different nuances on the way that it's taught. The way that we use is one that we've measured in terms of outcomes for our ladies, so we're sure that it's working for women with prolapse and for incontinence. So what this is doing is, although we're creating this lift through the pelvic floor, we're not exhaling to the extent that we're trying to exhale all of the air, because This seems to create downwards pressure onto the pelvic floor, and not that it's necessarily going to cause any problems, but it's more likely for their symptoms to stay the same or just have marginal improvements. And this is through having women coming in to train with us who've been taught through different organisations and training providers, and noticing that these are the really common things that are causing people to not progress in the same way as we would expect over, say, an 8-week period or a 12-week period. They're kind of just a bit stuck, and then when we take them through the programme, they follow the normal trend of improvements, which is really interesting. So I'm just going to have a little look at some case studies now. I'm just going to hop over onto my laptop and we'll just go through a few there. All the clients have very kindly said that I can share their data anonymised to further explain the technique and the programme. So I'm very, very grateful. So this is the first lady here. To give you a little bit of background, she's in her 30s. She had a grade 2.5 to 3 anterior wall prolapse and a grade 2 to 3 posterior wall prolapse. She had been diagnosed by physio and gynecology as well. She was actually told there was nothing else that could be done other than a pessary and surgery. Her symptoms were really bad. She had quite a significant bulge. She had had these symptoms for 4 years, and actually for this lady, Kegels were actually making her symptoms worse. She literally stumbled across hypopressives. Her scores are quite high here. So this is the POP-SS score here, questions 1 to 7, and then these questions are a little bit more detailed, and then you've got your quality of life scores kind of coming down at the bottom from 11. So she started off with an 8 for a feeling of something coming down from into her vagina, so that improved to a 1, which was a 87% improvement. And you can see down here, these were the symptoms that were bothering her the most were the sensations in her vagina, but also the feeling that her bowel hadn't emptied completely as well, which came down to a 2, which was a massive improvement. In terms of her physical activity, it was really affecting her. So she was a 7 when we started, and fantastically a 1 when we finished, so she did really well. We did a highly sensitive score for the POP-SS. I had spoken to the author, but we did 0 to 10 in terms of outcomes, just so we could be super sensitive to any changes, because otherwise it's never, occasionally, sometimes, and then it's difficult if it's still sometimes, so we don't know if it's improved or if, you know, what's gone on. So we did a highly sensitive score here, so we could really see if there are improvements, but here she started off with a score of 82. Out of a possible 150, and then she came down to 13. So this converted onto the POP-SS, and we remap the scores on there. She would have had a total of 16 as her starting score out of a possible 28, which then went down to a 5, so an improvement of 11 points there. And you can see on her scores here, it's really clear to see her before and after scores. Along here, you've got no symptoms, so the 0 score, up to 10, which is symptoms all the time. And you can see her bars at the beginning with the blue ones, and the pink ones are the finishing scores here. So you can see which symptoms were affecting her the most and which ones have come down to nothing. So 5 and 6, 12 and 13, those are all 100% improvements. And we do this as a improvement score for our clients because it just makes it really easy for them to see what's been going on and what their improvements have been. This lady did really, really well, and yeah, she's continuing to do well. This is a lady in her 60s. She'd actually had a prolapse for 5 years and had had a pessary for the last 4 years, and she was doing regular pelvic floor exercises, but she was only able to walk for about 20 minutes before it became too uncomfortable with a heaviness, and she was pushing up her prolapse quite a lot. She was diagnosed with a moderate anterior wall prolapse. So yeah, she'd had issues for 5 years, and then she again stumbled across hypopressives, came to work with us. So you can see here that she's getting symptoms roughly about half the time here, but it's really interfering with physical activity. So she's scoring a 9 for impact on physical activity, which again you can see down here with that whopping score there, and that has overall impacted her quality of life hugely. She got really, really good improvements. She's had in total about a 63% improvement. And in terms of the POP-SS, remapping the scores, she had a total of 7 out of a possible 28 to start off with, and then that went to a 4, so improvement of 3 there. Which was really good. And it's nice to see actually how women who've got a pessary in, it can make them feel more comfortable. The last lady in this mini case series, this is a lady in her 40s. She was diagnosed with a grade 2 apical prolapse and a grade 3 anterior wall prolapse. She'd had these symptoms for 3 years before working with us. Her main symptoms actually were urgency and stress incontinence that were bothering her, even though you can see how uncomfortable she is and how much it's affecting her life here. Couldn't walk her dog without having major issues, so that was a really big thing for her in terms of working with us and wanting to get improvements. And the pessary, yeah, so with the pessary, she was basically still getting leaking, so she'd had the pessary for a while, and she'd been advised to have surgery because her symptoms were so severe, really disrupting her life, as you can see. 9s and 10s for her first 3 scores on the POP-SS, and going down to here, massive impact in terms of her physical activity here. And you can see at the end of the program, she had a 92% improvement. Her POP-SS, a huge reduction from 20 out of a possible 28 down to 5. So that's a 15-point difference. And you can see here what a massive difference it made. And in terms of her incontinence, it made a huge difference. She was able to go on walks without leaking by the time we'd finished working together. So that was over 3 months. And some days she was having no pad changes at all, whereas she was changing multiple times every day before that. So it's just a really lovely overview of just a few ladies that I've worked with. And these are not uncommon improvements that we see with ladies in terms of severity of symptoms. So hopefully that's given you a really helpful overview on how hypopressives can help clients that you're working with, women with pelvic floor dysfunction. We also do work with men as well, and they can get really good improvements as well with their symptoms. If you've got any questions, then do pop a note in the description below and I'll get back to you. And otherwise, let me know if there's anything else you want me to cover.